I'm 32 years old, and the day my sister showed up crying for $8,000 to save our dad, I almost believed her. For years, I'd been the one everyone called when things fell apart, the one who dropped everything to fix problems that weren't mine to solve. But standing there in my doorway, watching her tears stream down her face as she begged me to wire the money immediately because the hospital wouldn't treat him without it, something felt different this time. Her voice cracked in all the right places, her hands trembled exactly how they should, but there was something almost rehearsed about the whole performance, like watching an actress who'd practiced her lines just a bit too much. Where you're watching from, you're probably wondering how I could doubt my own sister during what sounded like a life or death emergency. But trust me, by the end of this story, you'll understand exactly why that tiny seed of doubt saved me from something far worse than I could have imagined. But this felt like something more, whereas something calculated in a way that made my stomach twist even as guilt tried to pull me back toward that familiar pattern of just saying yes. What I discovered in the hours after she left my apartment didn't just expose one light unraveled years of manipulation that I'd been too afraid, too conditioned, too exhausted to see. Hit that subscribe button and drop a like because what unfolds next will make you question everyone you've ever trusted blindly. The moment I finally said the word no for the first time in my adult life, everything I thought I knew about family loyalty shattered like glass, really evaporating into something cold and calculated. And I realized that the real emergency wasn't happening in some hospital room. The real emergency was the one I'd been living in for years, trapped in a cycle where my love was being weaponized against me, where every crisis was designed to keep me exactly where they needed me, broke, exhausted, and too guilty to ever ask questions. What happened next changed everything I believed about family, responsibility, and the difference between helping someone and being their escape route from consequences they created themselves. I've been carrying my family on my back since I was 23 years old, and honestly, I can't even remember what it felt like before the weight settled into my shoulders like a permanent ache. Like these things always do, a few $100s here to help Claire with rent, 1,000 there when mom's car broke down, another chunk when dad needed help with medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. Each time, they promised it was temporary, that they'd pay me back, that this was just a rough patch and things would get better soon. But soon never came, and the rough patches merged into one endless storm where I was the only one expected to hold an umbrella big enough for everyone. By the time I hit 30, I had depleted my savings 3 times, postponed buying my own home twice, and canceled a vacation I'd planned for years because Claire called crying about an eviction notice that couldn't wait. My friends started making jokes about how I was more ATM than sister, and the humor stung because somewhere deep down I knew they were right. Every emergency came wrapped in the same packaging: tears, panic, and the unspoken threat that if I said no, I'd be the villain who let the family fall apart. The guilt was more effective than any chain could ever be, keeping me tethered to a role I never auditioned for but couldn't seem to quit. The exhaustion wasn't just financial, it was emotional, spiritual. The kind that seeps into your bones until you forget what it feels like to live for yourself. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning with anxiety clawing at my chest, calculating whether I could afford to help with the next crisis while still making my own rent, wondering if this time would finally be the time I'd run out of solutions. Words like boundaries and enabling. But those concepts felt abstract and cruel when measured against the very real faces of people I loved. What I didn't understand then was that love without limits isn't actually love, it's a cage that traps both the giver and the taker. And I was about to discover just how much damage that cage had done to all of us. Claire stood in my doorway that Tuesday evening, looking like she'd aged 5 years in 5 minutes, her mascara running in dark rivers down her cheeks, her whole body shaking with what seemed like genuine terror. "Naomi, please, you have to help me. Dad's in the hospital, and they won't do the surgery without $8,000 up front." She gasped, gripping my arm so tightly I could feel her nails digging through my sweater. Rush, something about a heart condition, emergency procedures, insurance denials, and a hospital administrator who allegedly told her they had until midnight to pay or they'd discharge him. Her voice broke on the word dying, and for a split second, every instinct in my body screamed at me to grab my checkbook and fix this immediately, like I always did. But something was off, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was at first. Claire's eyes darted around my apartment rather than holding my gaze, and her breathing seemed more theatrical than panic, like she was performing desperation rather than living it. The story itself came out too smoothly, too rehearsed, with specific dollar amounts and timelines that felt oddly precise for someone who was supposedly falling apart. I'd seen Claire in real crisis before, when her ex-boyfriend actually did threaten her, when she really did lose her job, and this didn't have that same raw, messy quality. This felt scripted, polished, like she'd practiced exactly what to say and how to say it before knocking on my door. "Which hospital is he at?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected, and I watched something flicker across her face: annoyance, maybe, or calculation. "Saint, we don't have time for questions. I need you to Venmo me the money right now because I have to get back there, she insisted, pulling out her phone and opening the app like the transaction was already a done deal. Pushy in a way that made my defenses rise instead of my sympathy. For the first time in my entire adult life, I heard myself say the words that would change everything. I need to call the hospital first and talk to Dad's doctor. The silence that followed was deafening, and in that moment, I watched my sister's mask of desperation crack just enough to see something calculating. My hands were actually shaking as I picked up my phone to dial St. Mary's, not from fear for my father, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of the word no still hanging in the air between us. Claire's entire demeanor shifted in real time. The tears stopped like someone had turned off a faucet. Her shoulders went rigid and her voice dropped from panicked to cold in a single breath. You're seriously going to waste time making phone calls while Dad could be dying? What kind of daughter are you? She hissed, and there it was, the guilt weapon being deployed exactly on schedule. But something in me had fundamentally shifted. Some internal wire had finally frayed after years of constant tension, and instead of backing down, I just started dialing. The woman who answered at St. Mary's Hospital was calm and professional, asking for my father's name, Richard Grand, putting me on a brief hold while she checked the system. Those 30 seconds felt like 30 hours, with Claire pacing behind me, muttering about how I was being paranoid and cruel, how I'd never forgive myself if something happened while I was playing detective. Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed because what happens next is absolutely insane. And leave a like if you're as shocked as I was when I heard what that hospital representative said. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, part of me genuinely terrified that I'd been wrong to doubt, that I was about to hear confirmation of the nightmare Claire had described. Her voice pleasant and unconcerned. Ma'am, I'm showing that Richard Gray was discharged yesterday afternoon in good condition following a routine checkup. There's no record of any emergency admission or surgical procedures scheduled. The floor seemed to drop out from under me, my vision tunneling as I processed what I just heard. Not relief that Dad was okay, but the sick, hollow realization that I'd just caught my sister in an elaborate, calculated lie. Phone still pressed to my ear, and watched the color drain from her face as she understood that her story had just collapsed. She didn't look scared or ashamed. She looked furious, like I'd ruined something important by refusing to play along. And that expression told me more about what was really happening than any explanation could. It was thick and suffocating, the kind of quiet that only exists when a truth too ugly to ignore has just been dragged into the light. Claire, I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. The hospital just told me Dad was discharged yesterday after a routine checkup. Lily of our hands of our leaves, her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for another lie. Another performance, but she must have realized that this particular show was over. The transformation was chilling. The desperate, crying sister evaporated completely, replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone whose eyes were hard and calculating rather than filled with tears. Just stood there staring at me with this mixture of anger and disbelief, like she couldn't comprehend that I'd actually had the audacity to fact-check her story. You actually called them. You couldn't just trust me for once. She finally spat out, and the sheer nerve of that statement nearly knocked the wind out of me. Trust her. After she'd just fabricated an entire medical emergency, complete with tearful performance and manufactured urgency, to manipulate $8,000 out of me. The audacity was breathtaking. But what disturbed me more was the lack of shame. She wasn't embarrassed about being caught lying. She was angry that I'd caught her. Tell me the truth right now, or get out of my apartment, I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice, and for a moment I thought she might actually leave. But then something shifted in her expression, a calculation happening behind her eyes, and I realized she was weighing whether a partial truth might still salvage the situation. What came next wasn't an apology, or even real honesty, it was damage control. A desperate attempt to reframe the lie as somehow justified. And as I listened to her speak, I began to understand that this moment wasn't just about $8,000 or one fabricated emergency, it was about finally seeing a pattern I'd been too close to recognize for years. Claire finally broke, but not in the way someone who's genuinely sorry breaks. She broke, like someone whose backup plan had just failed. Fine, you want the truth? I owe some people who accept late payments, she said, her voice shifting to a new kind of desperation, one tinged with genuine fear beneath the manipulation. She went on to explain that she'd gotten involved with some online gambling, that it had spiraled faster than she expected, and that the people she owed weren't going to wait for her to figure out a payment plan. It was just enough to buy her more time, to keep whoever these people were from doing whatever they'd threatened to do. What made my blood run cold wasn't the debt itself. People get in over their heads. I understood that tit was her explanation for why she lied about Dad. I knew you'd never give me money for gambling debts, but you'd give it for Dad in a heartbeat. She said it so casually, like she'd simply chosen the most efficient route to get what she needed. There was no remorse in her voice for using our father's health as emotional blackmail, no recognition that fabricating a medical crisis to steal money from your sister might be fundamentally wrong. She'd weaponized my love for our family, turned my sense of responsibility into a tool for her own purposes, and she genuinely seemed to believe that was just smart strategy. Well, so you thought lying about Dad dying was acceptable? You thought terrorizing me was just a reasonable way to solve your problem? I asked, my voice shaking now with anger rather than shock. Claire rolled her eyes. Yan said something that I'll never forget. Oh, come on, Naomi. It's not like I was asking for something you couldn't afford. You always have money saved because you never do anything fun with your life anyway. It was like a slap across the face, revealing exactly how she'd seen me all these years, not as a sister who loved her, but as a resource to be exploited, a boring, responsible bank account with legs. In that moment, I realized the problem wasn't just this light, it was years of lies I'd been too conditioned to question, too afraid to see. As Claire stood there expecting me to just hand over the money now that she'd told the truth, my mind started racing backward through years of so-called emergencies that suddenly looked completely different in this new light. There was the time 2 years ago when she needed $3,000, immediately because her landlord was supposedly evicting her for unpaid rent. Except I later found out from Mom that she'd actually moved in with a boyfriend that same week. Required $2,500 for repairs that insurance allegedly wouldn't cover, but I never saw any photos of damage or police reports despite asking multiple times. Every single crisis had the same elements: extreme urgency, emotional manipulation, and convenient timing that always seemed to coincide with when I'd just gotten a bonus or tax return. The worst part wasn't even the lies themselves, it was recognizing how she'd studied me, learned exactly which buttons to push to make me comply without question. She knew that mentioning Dad's health would send me into panic mode, that bringing up family loyalty would trigger my guilt, that framing things as life or death would bypass my rational thinking entirely. I'd thought I was being a good sister, a responsible daughter, someone who showed up when family needed help. But now I could see I'd actually been a mark, someone whose predictable responses and conditioned guilt made me the perfect target for financial manipulation. If you've ever realized someone you trusted was playing you like an instrument, hit that subscribe button because this gets so much deeper. I was doing the math in my head, rough estimates of how much money had flowed from my accounts to hers over the past decade, all wrapped in manufactured crises and emotional blackmail. We were talking about tens of thousands of dollars, maybe more. Money that could have been my down payment on a house, my emergency fund, my freedom to take risks in my career because I had a safety net. Instead, it had all disappeared into Claire's life, funding problems she created and then expected me to solve while she faced zero consequences for her choices. Standing there in my apartment, watching her tap her foot impatiently like I was the one being unreasonable, I felt something crack inside me, not my love for her, but my willingness to keep sacrificing myself on the altar of family obligation. I'm not giving you the money, Claire. Not ever again, I said, and the words felt both liberating and terrifying, like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. Her face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, rage, before settling into something cold and calculating that I'd never seen directed at me before.
Right now?
Maybe worse, because you're having some kind of moral crisis, she hissed, stepping closer in a way that felt almost threatening. The manipulation was so transparent now that I'd seen behind the curtain, but I could feel it trying to work anyway, that old familiar guilt attempting to reassert its grip. Wasn't budging. Claire switched tactics with the ease of someone who'd done this dance many times, before suddenly I wasn't just refusing to help, betraying everything we were supposed to stand for. Wait until Mom and Dad hear about this.
Oh.
Wait until everyone knows that you had the money to help me and chose not to, that you valued your precious savings more than your own sister's safety, she threatened, pulling out her phone like she was about to start a family-wide campaign against me. The threat should have scared me. Maybe a week ago it would have. But something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of what family actually meant versus what it had been twisted into. Go ahead and call them. You lied about Dad dying to manipulate money out of me for gambling debts, I said, my voice steadier than I felt inside, and I watched her face pale slightly as she realized her leverage was gone. She tried a few more approaches, crying again, this time real tears about how alone she felt, how I was the only one she could count on, how she'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to be abandoned. And I recognized them now for what they were, tried and tested manipulation techniques that had worked perfectly for years until this single moment, when I finally refused to play along, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frames on my walls. I stood there shaking but also feeling something I hadn't felt in years, the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having chosen myself over someone else's crisis. My phone started ringing at 7 the next morning, and I knew before answering that Claire had already launched her Or is Mom, her voice tight with that particular blend of disappointment and anger that she'd perfected over the years? Naomi, Claire just told me what happened, and I cannot believe you would turn your back on your sister when she needs you most. What has gotten into you? She said before I could even finish saying hello. About the lie, about the years of manipulation. But Mom cut me off with practice deficiency. None of that mattered compared to the fact that Claire was in trouble and I had refused to help. Over the next 48 hours, I received calls and texts from Dad, from my Aunt Linda, from Claire's best friend Jessica, all delivering variations of the same message. I was being selfish, cruel, and abandoning family when it mattered most. The truly insidious part was how they reframed everything suddenly. The lie about Dad wasn't a betrayal of trust, it was just Claire being dramatic in a crisis, something I should have expected and forgiven. My refusal to hand over $8,000 wasn't a boundary, it was evidence of how I had changed and gotten cold since I started making decent money. Nobody wanted to discuss the gambling, the manipulation, or the pattern of manufactured emergence. They only wanted to talk about how I was failing to fulfill my role as the family's financial safety net. What broke my heart wasn't the criticism itself, but the realization that they genuinely believed I was wrong, that in their worldview, maintaining family harmony meant I should keep funding Claire's chaos indefinitely. She's your sister, Naomi. Family helps family, no questions asked, Dad said during one particularly painful phone call, and I finally understood that no questions asked was exactly the problem. They didn't want questions because questions would require them to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, that Claire was an adult making destructive choices, that I'd been systematically exploited, that their definition of family love was actually just organized dysfunction. Before I tell you what happened next, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like if you've ever been blamed for refusing to enable someone's destructive behavior. The pressure was immense, suffocating, and for a few dark days, I genuinely wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. I spent 3 sleepless nights replaying every conversation, questioning whether I was really the villain in this story like everyone seemed to believe. My anxiety spiked so badly that I called in sick to work twice, something I'd never done even during my worst financial struggles helping the family. The guilt was crushing, whispering that maybe I should just pay the money to make peace, that $8,000 wasn't worth losing my entire family over, that I could set better boundaries next time. But there was a quieter voice underneath all that noise, a voice that had been silenced for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. And that voice was asking why making peace required me to fund my sister's gambling debts while she faced 0 consequences. On the 4th day, I did something I'd never done before. I went to see a therapist, not just for one of those casual sessions where you vent about stress, but with real desperation to understand if I was actually losing my mind. Without interrupting, Naomi, with this exact story fabricating a dying parent to manipulate money for gambling debts, would you give them $8,000? The answer was so obvious it was almost funny, and yet I'd been tying myself in knots trying to justify why family should get different treatment. She helped me see that I wasn't refusing to help my sister, I was refusing to enable her, and there was a universe of difference between those two things. Walking out of that therapy session, I felt something shift in my chest, like a weight I'd been carrying for a decade had suddenly loosened its grip. I went home, blocked Claire's number, and sent one final text to my parents. I love you both, but I'm not going to keep funding emergencies that could be prevented by basic adult responsibility. When you're ready to have an honest conversation about Claire's gambling and the pattern of manipulation, I'm here. Until then, I need space. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful exactly, but it was mine, my life, my choices, my boundary, held firm for the first time in my adult life. Some people call that selfish, and I was finally beginning to understand the difference. The weeks after I cut Claire off felt eerily quiet, like the calm after a storm when you're not sure if another wave is coming or if it's finally over. For the first time in years, my phone wasn't lighting up every few days with some new crisis needing immediate cash, and that silence was both unsettling and strangely peaceful. I kept waiting for another guilt-laced call, another long message about how heartless I'd become, but instead, there was nothing. Before I go on, if this is resonating with you at all, hit subscribe and leave a like, especially if you've ever wondered what happens when you finally stop being the family's emergency fund. Without my money as a quick fix, the cracks in everyone else's lives started showing fast. I heard through a cousin that Claire had tried the same dads in the hospital story on our Aunt Linda, but this time the lie collapsed immediately because Linda actually called my parents, but at Claire for dragging his health into her mess again. And for the first time, someone besides me called her behavior what it really was, manipulative and dangerous. Apparently, when there was no easy bailout, the rest of the family had to actually look at Claire's choices instead of hiding behind the idea that I would fix everything. It didn't magically turn into accountability overnight, of course. On her behalf, stress bad influences. A rough patch, but the key difference was that this time, no one had me to fall back on. Claire had to negotiate with the people she owed, sell some of her things, pick up extra shifts, and deal with the actual consequences she'd spent years avoiding by running to me. And as messy as that was to watch from a distance, it also made one thing painfully clear. They had always been capable of solving their own problem. I hadn't been the savior of the family. I'd been the crutch that kept everyone from learning to walk on their own. Once the constant emergencies stopped, I realized how much of my life had been built around preparing for other people's disasters, instead of dreaming about my own future. I sat down one Sunday afternoon with my bank statements and a notebook and, for the first time, added up roughly how much money I had handed out over the past 10 years. The number made my stomach drop. It was enough for a solid down payment on a home, a new car, a fully funded emergency savings account, and then some. But after the shock settled, something unexpected came in its place: clarity. I couldn't change what I'd given, but I could absolutely decide what I would and wouldn't give from that day forward. We started small, setting up an automatic transfer into a savings account every payday, booking a meeting with a financial planner, and actually allowing myself to think about what I wanted my life to look like 5 years from now. I went back to therapy weekly, not just to process what had happened with Claire, but to untangle why I'd believed my worth was tied to how much I could sacrifice for others. About being the good kid. Found about how my parents had leaned on me financially. It was uncomfortable, sometimes painful work, but as those old beliefs loosened their hold, I started noticing something. I could breathe easier. With time, the space that used to be filled with other people's emergencies started filling with my own small joys. Nothing fancy, just a quiet cabin and a stack of books, and didn't feel guilty once. I signed up for a pottery class I'd always wanted to try, spent money on things that brought me peace instead of on problems I didn't create. The more I chose myself in these small, steady ways, the less appealing the old role of family savior seemed. What happened with Claire had shattered something in me, but it also built something new in its place, a life that was finally mine, not an endless reaction to everyone else's chaos. About 3 months after our blow-up, I received a text from Claire that simply said, "Can we talk? I want to apologize." Suspicion was, this another angle, another manipulation dressed up as remorse. The curiosity won out, and I agreed to meet her at a neutral coffee shop, making sure to arrive with firm boundaries already set in my mind. When she looked different, somehow tired maybe, or humbled, like life without easy bailouts had taken some of the shine off her usual confidence. And for the first time in our adult lives, there was no immediate crisis hanging between us, just awkward silence and uncertainty. Her apology started out promising. She admitted the lie about Dad was wrong, that she'd manipulated me for years, that her gambling had gotten out of control and she'd used me as an escape hatch instead of facing her problems. For a few minutes I felt that old familiar pull, that desire to forgive and restore and go back to being sisters the way we used to be. But then, as she kept talking, subtle phrases started creeping in. "I know I messed up, but you have to understand how desperate I was, and I'm working on it, but it would be easier if I knew you had my back." The apology wasn't actually about acknowledging harm, it was about reopening the door to my wallet with a gentler approach. When I didn't immediately offer reconciliation or money, her tone shifted slightly, becoming more pointed. "I'm trying here, Naomi. I'm actually working on myself, going to meetings, but it's hard when my own sister won't even support my recovery," she said, and there it was, the new version of the old manipulation. Now I wasn't just refusing to fund her chaos, I was actively sabotaging her healing journey by maintaining boundaries. That well-worn groove in my brain that said maybe I should help, but this time I recognized it for what it was. "I'm glad you're getting help, Claire, and I hope you succeed. But my support doesn't come with money attached anymore. And if that's not enough for you, then we don't have much to talk about," I said quietly, watching her face harden as she realized this meeting wasn't going to end the way she'd planned. After that coffee shop meeting, I spent a long time thinking about what it actually means to love someone versus what it means to enable their destruction while calling it love. Dr. Chen had given me a framework that finally made sense. If your help allows someone to avoid consequences they need to face, you're not helping them, you're helping them stay stuck, to feel the full weight of her choices without a safety net, because that was the only way she'd ever build real motivation to change. My love had been keeping her comfortable in dysfunction, giving her just enough rescue that she never had to do the hard work of rescuing herself. The hardest part was accepting that some people aren't ready to change, and no amount of money, support, or sacrifice from me could make Claire ready before she decided for herself. I'd spent years believing that, if I just loved her enough, helped enough, gave enough, she'd eventually turn things around and we'd all look back on this as a difficult period we got through together. But that was a fantasy based on control. I never actually had died, couldn't save Claire from herself. And trying to do so had only damaged us both. She'd learned that consequences were optional as long as she could cry hard enough. And I'd learned that my value was measured in dollars and immediate availability. Redefining love meant accepting that the most caring thing I could do was let cushioning the fall reality of her choices without cushioning the fall. It meant loving her enough to believe she was capable of solving her own problems, even if watching her struggle was painful. Loving me, somebody, for making next about family dynamics will honestly blow your mind. Some people heard about my boundaries and called me cold, heartless, a bad sister, but those same people had never once offered to be the emergency fund themselves, had never sacrificed their savings or dreams or peace of mind. They'd been perfectly content to let me carry that burden while they maintained their comfortable relationships with Claire. And now that I'd stepped back, suddenly everyone had opinions about what real family looked like. Without me as the designated problem solver, the family dynamics shifted in ways nobody expected, least of all me. About 4 months after I'd set my boundaries, I got a call from Mom that started with an exasperated sigh. Claire had called her asking for money to cover utility bills, and Mom had actually said no. I told her she needs to figure it out herself, that we can't keep doing this, Mom said, and I almost dropped my phone in shock. For years, Mom had been one of my biggest critics for refusing to help, and now here she was, discovering firsthand why constant bailouts weren't actually helping anyone. She didn't apologize for how she'd treated me during the initial blow-up, but there was something in her voice that sounded like understanding, maybe even respect. Dad had a similar awakening when Claire tried to move back home, just temporarily to save money, and he realized that temporary had a way of becoming permanent when there were no real consequences for poor planning.
Maximum.
Had to contribute to household expenses, and needed to show proof she was attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings. The fact that he set boundaries at all was revolutionary. The fact that Claire threw a tantrum and accused him of being cruel just proved how conditioned we'd all been to accept her manipulation as normal. Dad called me after one particularly heated argument with her. Not to ask for advice, but just to say, I think I understand now why you had to step back. This is exhausting. What fascinated me most was watching how Claire adapted when the easy money dried up from all sources. She didn't suddenly become responsible overnight. There were still drama and crises and attempts to find new people to manipulate, but she also started actually working more hours, sold her expensive car for something affordable, and began making small payments on her debts. Were these changes because she'd experienced some profound moral awakening? Probably not. They were because she'd finally run out of escape routes and had to face reality. And while I felt no satisfaction in watching her struggle was the most honest thing that had happened in our family in years, everyone was finally dealing with the truth instead of hiding behind my money. The more I worked with Dr. Chen, the more I realized that the dynamic with Claire wasn't something I'd invented. It was a pattern passed down through generations of my family like some kind of toxic heirloom. My grandmother had been the responsible one who bailed out her siblings. My mom had played that role with her younger brother, and somehow I'd inherited the position without ever consciously agreeing to it. We'd all been taught that this was what love looked like in our family: sacrifice without boundaries, help without questions, loyalty that meant absorbing everyone else's chaos while smiling through your own pain. Breaking that pattern meant becoming the villain in the story that had been written long before I was born. The pushback I received wasn't just about money, it was about refusing to play a role that kept the entire family system functional way. Everyone else had to feel the actual impact of Claire's choices, and that discomfort made them angry at me rather than at the situation itself. It's easier to blame the person who changes the rules were broken all along. My Aunt Linda stopped inviting me to family gatherings for a while, not because she was truly upset, but because my presence reminded everyone of uncomfortable truths they'd rather ignore. I'd become a mirror reflecting back all the ways we'd normalized dysfunction and called it love. But here's what nobody tells you about breaking generational patterns. It's lonely as hell, especially at first. There were holidays I spent alone, family events I wasn't invited to, inside jokes and shared moments I was excluded from because I'd chosen to be the circuit breaker in a system built on enabling, questioned my choices constantly, and had moments where I genuinely wondered if maintaining my boundaries was worth losing my family. What kept me going was something Dr. Chen said during one particularly dark session. You're not just healing yourself, you're ending a cycle that would have continued through your children and their children. That's worth protecting, even when it hurts. She was right, though it took me a long time to fully believe it. Initial confrontation with Claire. Newly rented apartment, nothing fancy, but it was mine, paid for with money I'd saved instead of given away. When I had this sudden, overwhelming realization that I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt anxious about my bank account. For years, that low-level panic had been my constant companion, the background noise of my life, always calculating whether I could afford the next family emergency while still covering my own bills. Now, looking at my savings account with an actual buffer for the first time in a decade, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my early 20s, financial peace. It wasn't about having a lot of money, it was about knowing that what I had was actually mine to keep. The freedom went deeper than finances though. I'd started saying no to things outside my family, 2 extra projects at work that didn't come with extra pay, friends who only called when they needed favors, social obligations that drained rather than energized me. Once you learn that boundaries won't actually kill you or make you a terrible person, it becomes easier to apply them everywhere. But I'd spent so long believing that my worth came from how useful I could be to others that I'd never asked whether being constantly useful was leaving any energy for my own life. Turns out, when you stop running yourself into the ground for everyone else, you discover there's a whole person underneath who has dreams and needs and desires that matter just as much as anyone else's. The biggest surprise was how my relationship with my parents slowly began to improve once the Claire drama wasn't constantly at the center of every conversation. Dad and I started having actual talks about his life, his regrets, his own struggles with enabling Claire over the years, conversations we'd never had when I was too busy being the family ATM to be a real daughter. But eventually she admitted that watching me set boundaries had made her think about her own patterns, her own tendency to sacrifice everything for family peace. We weren't suddenly the perfect family, we still had our issues, our disagreements, our uncomfortable silences, but there was more honesty in our relationships than there had been in years. And honesty, I was learning, was worth more than fake harmony. Part of this whole journey was realizing that getting something out of the dysfunctional dynamic too, even if I'd never consciously acknowledged it. Being the rescuer meant I always had a clear purpose, always knew exactly what my role was supposed to be. There's a weird kind of comfort in martyrdom. It protects you from having to ask yourself harder questions about who you are when you're not busy saving everyone else. When I stopped being the family hero, I had to confront the fact that I'd hidden behind that role for years, using other people's crises as an excuse, not to build my own life or take my own risks. Dr. Chen helped me see that I'd been afraid of my own potential. My own dreams require vulnerability and the possibility of failure. If you're constantly managing everyone else's disasters, you never have to face your own goals and the terrifying question of whether you're capable of achieving them. Claire's manipulation had worked so well, partly because I'd been a willing participant in my own exploitation, not consciously, not maliciously, but because being needed felt safer than being free. It wasn't about blaming myself. Both of us served both of us in twisted ways that ultimately hurt everyone involved. The real work wasn't just setting boundaries with Claire, it was building a life that didn't revolve around crisis management, drama, or the emotional high of being someone's savior. Uncomfortable reality that I'd wasted years of my life on a dynamic that benefited no one, that I couldn't get that time or money back, and that the only thing I could control was what I did from this moment forward. Some days that felt empowering, other days it felt like mourning. But gradually, through therapy and deliberate practice, I started defining myself by what I was building, by who I wanted to become rather than who everyone needed me to. And that shift, more than any boundary I set with Claire, was what actually set me free. About a year after everything fell apart with Claire, I met someone who completely changed my understanding of what relationships could look like when they weren't built on need and crisis. And we met at a work conference where I was actually attending sessions instead of skipping them to handle family emergencies like I'd done at previous events. It's what struck me first, wasn't romance, it with this easy balance of love and boundaries that I'd never witnessed up close. He mentioned his brother struggling with addiction, and when I asked how he helped, Marcus said something that stopped me cold. I love him, but I can't save him. So I show up for the recovery work he does and step back from the chaos he creates. Dating Marcus was like learning a new language, where caring about someone didn't automatically mean sacrificing yourself on their behalf. Early in our relationship, Emily history would scare him off. He didn't tell me I should reconcile or that family always comes first no matter what. Instead, he asked me how holding those boundaries felt, whether I was proud of the life I was building, and if there was anything I needed support with as I navigated the ongoing fallout. It was such a foreign response that I actually cried, not from sadness but from the relief of being seen as a whole person rather than just a potential resource or problem solver. What I learned from Marcus wasn't that my family had been wrong and his was right, it was that there were infinite ways to love people, and some of those ways were healthier than others. He showed me what it looked like when someone supported your boundaries instead of testing them, when I can't do that was met with okay instead of guilt and manipulation. Being with someone who didn't need me to just be present, to enjoy companionship without the constant anxiety of waiting for the next crisis. Hopefully, I started believing that maybe I deserved relationships built on mutual respect rather than desperate need, romantic, familial, or otherwise. I wasn't expecting the call from Mom 2 years after the initial blow-up, and I definitely wasn't expecting what she had to say. Claire had been arrested for writing bad checks. Apparently the gambling had continued, the debts had grown, and she'd gotten desperate enough to keep the creditors at bay, asking if I'd help with bail money, and for a split second I felt that old familiar pull to jump in and fix it. But then I heard myself say something I'd never said before. No, Mom, Claire needs to sit with the consequences this time. If you bail her out, she'll never stop. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with disappointment, but underneath it, I thought I detected something else: relief. Maybe that someone was finally willing to say what needed to be said. Claire spent 3 days in jail before Dad bailed her out, but with strict conditions that shocked me. She had to move back home, attend mandatory therapy and GA meetings, get a full-time job, and submit to random drug tests since her gambling had apparently progressed to other issues. For the first time in her adult life, Claire faced real consequences that she couldn't charm or manipulate her way out of. And according to Mom, she was furious at everyone, especially me, that everyone turned against her because of you. And I felt a pang of sadness, not guilt, but genuine sorrow that Claire still couldn't see how her own choices had led here. I'd been a convenient scapegoat, but I wasn't the one who'd gambled away thousands, lied about medical emergency, or committed fraud. What happened over the next several months was something I'd stopped hoping for. Claire actually started doing the work. Relapses, moments where she tried to test boundaries again, but she was showing up to meetings, seeing a therapist who specialized in addiction, and slowly, painfully, starting to take responsibility for her life. Mom sent me updates occasionally, always careful not to ask for money, and I could hear the cautious hope in her voice. I didn't rush to reconcile or celebrate. I learned that real change takes years, not months, and that my role wasn't to be Claire's cheerleader or critic. My role was to keep living my own life while holding space for the possibility that maybe, someday, we could have an actual relationship built on honesty instead of desperation. Brewing 2.5 years after our coffee shop meeting. Written letter that arrived at my apartment instead of a manipulative text. The letter was different from anything she'd sent before. No requests for money, just pages of detailed acknowledgement about what she'd done, how it had affected me, and the work she'd been doing to understand why she'd become someone capable of such calculated manipulation. About facing the shame of her arrest, about realizing that every time I'd bailed her out, she'd learned that consequences were negotiable if she performed desperation convincingly enough. For the first time, she wasn't asking me to understand or forgive. She was simply telling me she understood what she'd done and why it was wrong. Read that letter 3 times, feeling emotions I couldn't quite name, not forgiveness exactly, but something softer than the anger I'd carried for so long. We started texting occasionally, surface-level stuff at first. Housework. Did you see that movie? Mom said you got a promotion. The conversations were awkward, stilted, like two strangers trying to find common ground in a language neither of them spoke fluently anymore. Part of me wanted to rush toward reconciliation, to believe that her change was permanent and complete, to have my sister back in whatever form that might take. But Dr. Chen reminded me that real amends aren't just about apologies, they're about sustained behavioral change over time. And time was the one thing you couldn't rush. Reconnection, when her $1,500 for a certification program that would help her career, promising she'd pay it back within 3 months, but with deep disappointment, because I'd started to hope that maybe things really had changed. Claire, I'm not lending you money. You can save for it or find payment plans, but my financial support isn't part of our relationship anymore, I said gently but firmly. There was a long pause, then a sigh. Then, yeah, I figured you'd say that. It was worth a shot though. That casual worth a shot told me everything I needed to know, that therapy had been real, but underneath it all, part of her still saw me as a potential resource rather than just a sister. And that's when I realized that reconciliation couldn't happen until she genuinely didn't need anything from me. And we clearly weren't there yet. The hardest thing I had to accept was that despite all the therapy, all the growth I'd done, my relationship with Claire might never be what I wanted it to be. There's this narrative in self-help culture that if you do all the right things, set boundaries, communicate clearly, give people space to change, eventually everything works out and relationships heal into something beautiful and functional. But real life isn't that neat. And sometimes people change just enough to be less destructive, but not enough to be truly trustworthy. And you have to decide if you can live in that gray area or if you need to step back completely for your own peace. I stayed in contact with Claire at a surface level, showed up for major family events where she'd be present, remained civil and even kind when we interacted. But I didn't let her back into the deeper chambers of my life where she could do real damage again. We weren't enemies, but we also weren't sisters in the way I'd once imagined sisters should be, sharing secrets, relying on each other, building adult friendship alongside family obligation. Instead, we were relatives who'd survived something painful together and come out the other side fundamentally changed by it, maintaining connection more out of shared history than genuine closeness. Said I was holding a grudge or hadn't really forgiven, but they didn't understand that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or pretending past harm didn't happen. What I learned through all of this is that you can release anger without restoring full trust, that you can wish someone well without letting them back into your inner circle, that you can love people from a distance that keeps you safe. Claire and I will probably never have the sister relationship that movies and Instagram posts make you think is possible, if you just try hard enough. and grieving that loss was its own kind of work. But in letting go of what could never be, I made space for relationships that actually nourished me, friendships built on reciprocity, a partnership with Marcus that felt balanced and healthy, connections with people who valued me as a whole person rather than an emergency contact. The family I'd been born into had taught me painful lessons about love. The family I was choosing to build around me was teaching me what love could actually feel like when it was healthy. 3 years after that initial confrontation in my doorway, I bought my first home, a small 2-bedroom house with a backyard that needed work, but had potential I could actually see. Living room on closing day. I've given away over the years how I could have bought this house twice over if I'd kept it for myself. But instead of feeling bitter, I felt something closer to pride, because this house, modest as it was, represented something those lost thousands never could have. Proof that I'd learned to build a life for myself instead of funding everyone else's chaos. Every mortgage payment was a choice to invest in my own future. Every improvement I made was evidence that I deserved a foundation as solid as the one I had tried to provide for my family. Marcus and I got engaged that same year, and planning a wedding forced me to confront one final decision about Claire and my family dynamics. One of the most important days of my life, knowing she might create drama or use the event to test boundaries again. After weeks of agonizing and several therapy sessions dedicated entirely to this question, no substances, no borrowing money from guests, and if she caused any disruption, she'd be asked to leave. Even gave a toast that made me cry, not because it erased the past, but because it acknowledged it honestly without making excuses. My sister taught me what real love looks like by refusing to enable my destruction, she said, and in that moment, I saw glimpses of the person she was working to become. The life I'd built wasn't perfect or Instagram-worthy in the way that makes everything look effortlessly beautiful. Old guilt tried to creep back in. Still got calls from extended family members who hadn't learned the boundaries lesson. Still wondered sometimes if I'd been too harsh or not, forgiving enough. But I also had peace, actual, sustainable peace that came from knowing my bank account was mine. My emotional energy was mine to allocate as I saw fit. I had a partner who understood that family first didn't mean family at all costs, friends who respected my boundaries instead of testing them, and a growing confidence that my worth wasn't measured by how much I sacrificed. The woman who'd stood in that doorway 3 years ago, terrified to say no, felt like a different person, not because I'd become cold or uncaring, but because I'd finally learned that caring for others couldn't come at the cost of destroying myself. If I'm being completely honest, choosing myself came with losses that still ache sometimes, family gatherings that feel awkward, a sister I'll probably never be truly close to again, relationships with relatives that never fully recovered from my decision to stop playing the role they needed me in. There's a version of my life where I kept saying yes, kept being the person everyone could count on to sacrifice endlessly. And in that version, maybe the family would still be intact in the way it used to be. But in that version, I'd also still be broke, anxious, exhausted, and slowly disappearing into a role that consumed everything I could have become. The price of freedom was high, but the cost of staying trapped would have been my entire life. Or what I wish someone had told me years ago is that you can't love people into changing. You can't sacrifice enough to fix what's broken in others, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let people face the natural consequences of their choices. The manipulation only worked because I believed that my love was supposed to look like endless giving, that good family members never said no, that my comfort mattered less than everyone else's immediate need. Breaking free meant unlearning all of those lies and building new definitions of love that included self-preservation, boundaries, and the radical idea that I mattered just as much as the people I was trying to save. The strangest gift of this whole nightmare is that it taught me what I was capable of, not just the strength to say no, but the courage to rebuild an entire life from scratch when the old one had been built on dysfunction. Not a command I have to obey. That other people's anger at my boundaries says more about me, and that peace is worth protecting even when the cost is loneliness. Some days I still miss the simplicity of just being the hero, of having a clear role and purpose, even if it was slowly killing me. But most days, I'm grateful for the woman I've become. On the other side of that crisis, someone who knows her worth isn't tied to her usefulness, someone who can receive love without performing for it. Someone who finally understands that you can't pour from an empty cup, no matter how desperately the people around you are thirsty. It's about for hearing my story. What would you have done in my place? Would you have given Claire the $8,000, or drawn the same line I did? I'm genuinely curious how you see it, because everyone who heard it in my real life had a different opinion. Or do you believe there comes a point where protecting your own sanity and future has to come before family obligations, no matter how much backlash you get? What's your take on this whole situation and family manipulation, fake emergencies, and the pressure to always be the responsible one? Do you believe that revenge is ever really about getting even, or is it more about reclaiming your life from people who've taken advantage for too long? And when it comes to Is cutting someone off a form of revenge, or is it just finally choosing self-respect over guilt? Was I wrong for what I did, for refusing the money? For walking away when everyone said I was abandoning my family? For not fully reconciling even after Claire apologized? Let me know in the comments, because I know some people will say blood is blood and others will say enough is enough. If you've ever been in a similar position, I'd really like to hear how you handled it and whether you'd do anything differently now. If you want more stories like this about family drama, betrayal, and the messy truth behind so-called loyalty, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Don't miss the upcoming video where I share an even crazier story about how my own mother tried to guilt-trip me into paying off a secret loan she took out in my name. Trust me, you're not going to believe what she said when I confronted her.